For many of Jeffrey Epstein's victims, the long-awaited release of files held by the U.S. Department of Justice was not a moment of relief, it was a moment of anger. Survivors have told reporters that the disclosure, partial, heavily redacted, and incomplete, left them feeling once again ignored by the very institutions meant to deliver justice. Thousands of documents were released at the end of last week, all connected to Epstein, the convicted sex offender who died in federal custody in 2019. But what the public received was not full transparency. It was a controlled disclosure, and victims noticed immediately. The files contain words and images that add to what is already known about Epstein's life and crimes. They reinforce his role as a serial sexual predator who used wealth, access, and manipulation to abuse young girls over many years. One survivor described the release bluntly. This was a pedophile in PDF format. A release that reopened wounds. For survivors, this was not just another document dump. It was a reminder of how long their voices have gone unheard. The documents describe how abuse often began during so-called massage sessions, a recruitment tactic survivors have described for years. The language in the files reflects a chilling normalization of exploitation, confirming testimony that has already been entered into court records. But alongside these confirmations came deep frustration. The Department of Justice did not publish the full archive. Large sections are blacked out. Faces are hidden. Entire pages are unreadable. Survivors say this incomplete release feels like history repeating itself. We asked for full disclosure, one survivor said. The people who trafficked us shouldn't be able to walk free without consequences. Another survivor described the reaction not as shock, but exhaustion. I'm not surprised, she said. I'm let down. The redactions that sparked anger. One of the most controversial elements of the release is the scale of redaction. Survivors have pointed specifically to the existence of 119 pages that are completely blacked out, not partially redacted, but erased in full. For many victims, this crosses a line. There's no way that's only about protecting victims' identities, said one survivor who reviewed the files. There better be a good reason, because right now we don't see one. The DOJ has argued that redactions are necessary to protect survivors, but survivors themselves are questioning that explanation. They argue that while protecting identities is critical, blanking out entire documents without explanation feels like protection of institutions, not people. When asked whether victims feel abandoned, the answer was immediate. We've been left behind since day one. One woman said, that's why we're fighting louder now. We're tired. What the documents reveal and what they don't. Even with redactions, the files reflect the extreme nature of Epstein's abuse. Some documents include descriptions of recruitment preferences that survivors say confirm what they experienced. One file references instructions allegedly given to recruiters that prioritize age on a language that survivors describe as horrifying but validating. Other documents include interviews conducted by federal agents with victims who were approximately 13 years old at the time of abuse. One account describes a girl being instructed to wear a school-style outfit by Ghislaine Maxwell before serving Epstein. These details are deeply disturbing, but for survivors, they are not new. What is new is seeing them acknowledged in official government files. Yet survivors say acknowledgement without accountability is not enough. As survivors reacted with anger and disappointment, the political response to the Epstein files release added another layer of controversy. The White House framed the disclosure as proof of unprecedented transparency, pointing to the thousands of documents made public and emphasizing that more releases are planned. Officials described the process as careful, victim-centered, and responsible, but for many observers, especially survivors, that narrative doesn't align with what was actually released. Transparency claimed, trust undermined. Yes, thousands of documents were published, but transparency is not measured by volume alone. It is measured by completeness, clarity, and consistency. And on those points, critics argue the release falls short. For all the names that appear in the files, there is a striking absence when it comes to others, particularly powerful political figures. Media coverage has noted that while Epstein's celebrity associations are visible, there is little new material involving President Donald Trump in this first batch. Trump has previously stated that he distanced himself from Epstein in the early 2000s and denies any knowledge of his criminal behavior. A single photograph, reportedly showing Trump at Epstein's desk, briefly appeared on the DOJ website before being removed. It was one of more than a dozen images taken down shortly after publication. That removal alone alone raised new questions. According to reporting, there may be hundreds or even over 1,000 references to Trump across the full Epstein archive, yet none of that material has surfaced so far. Officials insist this does not mean such references don't exist, only that they have not yet been released, which leads to an obvious concern. Is the disclosure being staged? Timing is everything. The timing of the release has also drawn scrutiny. The first batch of files was published late on a Friday night, just before Christmas, a moment when political attention in Washington and the media ecosystem traditionally drops. Lawmakers leave town, newsrooms thin out, public focus shifts elsewhere. Survivors and transparency advocates question whether this timing was coincidental. If more documents are set to be released over the next 2 weeks, that schedule would place additional disclosures squarely in the holiday period, when stories tend to land softer and provoke less sustained scrutiny. For survivors who have waited years, even decades, this feels familiar. Important information emerges quietly. Attention moves on, accountability stalls, survivors push back. For those directly harmed by Epstein and his network, the political framing is not just frustrating, it feels dismissive. They argue that a release designed around optics rather than impact reinforces the very system that failed them. Survivors say they were not consulted meaningfully about how the files would be released, how redactions would be explained, or how their stories would be contextualized. One survivor summed it up simply: this wasn't done with us in mind, and that perception matters, because trust in institutions is not restored by press releases. It is restored by transparency that survivors themselves recognize as honest. Power still shapes the narrative. The files confirm what many already suspected. Epstein surrounded himself with wealth, celebrity, and influence. But survivors argue that influence did not disappear when he died. It shifted. Decisions about what to release, when to release it, and how much context to provide are still being made by powerful institutions, the same ones that failed to stop Epstein in the first place. That reality is why survivors are no longer content with symbolic transparency. They are demanding accountability with consequences. As survivors examined the documents line by line, many said the files did not shock them. They confirmed what authorities had long been told and failed to act on. Even through heavy redactions, the pattern is unmistakable. The younger, the better. One of the most disturbing details referenced in the newly released material is language attributed to recruitment practices. In survivor accounts reflected in the files, recruiters were allegedly given guidance that emphasized age. Survivors say this mirrors what they experienced firsthand of a system that actively sought out younger girls because they were easier to control, intimidate, and silence. This is not presented as rumor. It appears within investigative summaries and interview notes tied to federal inquiries. In one interview documented in the files, a special agent records testimony from a girl who was approximately 13 years old at the time of abuse. The age is not ambiguous. It is written plainly. Survivors say seeing this detail acknowledged in federal records is both validating and devastating. Validating because it confirms they told the truth. Devastating because it confirms the system knew. Control, ritual, and psychological abuse. Some documents include descriptions that go beyond physical exploitation and into psychological domination. One account describes a girl being instructed by Ghislaine Maxwell to wear a school-style outfit before interacting with Epstein. Survivors say these details matter because they show intentional role-playing and manipulation designed to reinforce power imbalance and dependency. This was not random behavior. Survivors describe it as ritualized, repeated, and enforced. The files also reference Epstein's properties as consistent locations for abuse. Names and addresses recur, patterns repeat, victim statements align across years and jurisdictions. For survivors, this consistency destroys any remaining claim that Epstein's crimes were isolated incidents or misunderstandings. The documents show repetition, and repetition implies organization. Why confirmation is not closure. Despite the disturbing clarity of these details, survivors say confirmation alone does not equal justice. Many of these facts were already present in civil testimony, sworn statements, and police reports years ago. What survivors wanted and still want is accountability for those who enabled the abuse to continue, who recruited, who transported, who paid, who looked away. Those answers remain largely hidden behind redactions, and that's where frustration turns into anger. Survivors argue that the government's choice to redact entire sections, even those that do not obviously identify victims, prevents the public from understanding how Epstein's network functioned and who may have played active roles. The weight of being seen and still ignored. Several survivors have described the emotional toll of reading the files. Seeing their experiences reflected in official documents should have been a moment of acknowledgement. Instead, many describe it as reopening wounds without resolution. You see it written down, one survivor said, and you realize they knew and you realize nothing changed. That realization fuels the growing demand for answers beyond Epstein himself. Because Epstein is dead, Maxwell has been convicted, but survivors say those facts do not explain how a system allowed abuse of minors to persist for years under the watch of powerful institutions. For survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse, this release was never about curiosity or spectacle. It was about accountability, and that is precisely what they say is still missing. As the final pages of the first batch were examined, one message from survivors became unmistakably clear. This disclosure does not feel like justice. We are still fighting, survivors say. The incomplete nature of the release reinforces a painful truth that they have been forced to fight at every stage, fight to be believed, fight to be heard, fight for records that should never have been sealed in the first place. Many expressed outrage that entire sections of the archive remain inaccessible, especially when those sections could explain how Epstein's network operated and who enabled it. The concern is not only about Epstein, but about the individuals who trafficked, recruited, facilitated, or protected him. Survivors argue that shielding those people, intentionally or not, allows them to continue living freely without consequence, and that, they say, is unacceptable. Why the redactions still matter. The Department of Justice maintains that redactions are necessary to protect victims. Survivors do not dispute the need for privacy. What they dispute is the lack of transparency around why certain materials are erased in full. When 119 pages of grand jury material are completely blacked out, survivors say it stretches credibility to claim every word would reveal victim identities. To them, it looks like institutional self-protection. And when images briefly appear online, only to be removed without explanation, why now it fuels suspicion rather than trust. Survivors aren't asking for spectacle. They're asking for clarity, accountability beyond Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Ghislaine Maxwell has been convicted, but survivors insist that this cannot be where the story ends. They want investigations into recruiters and intermediaries, financial enablers, officials who ignored early warnings, institutions that failed to act. They also want transparency around decision-making, who chose not to prosecute, who delayed investigations, and who signed off on non-disclosure. Several survivors and their attorneys have signaled that legal action remains on the table, including civil cases aimed at forcing further disclosure from federal agencies. The next releases and the stakes. The DOJ has promised more documents in the coming weeks. Survivors are watching closely. What happens next will determine how this moment is remembered. If future releases bring clarity, context, and accountability, this could mark a turning point, and not just in the Epstein case, but in how institutions handle crimes involving power and influence. If not, survivors fear this will become another chapter in a long history of half-truths and quiet closures. Why this still matters. This story is not about the past alone. It is about whether victims can ever trust systems designed to protect them. It is about whether transparency laws have real force. And it is about whether power continues to shape justice behind closed doors. As one survivor put it, we're not done. We're just getting louder. The Epstein files may be unsealed, but the full record is still incomplete. And until it is, this story is far from over.